Hi there! Do you also find it super annoying when you're having a drink outside that this keeps happening? And don't you just hate it when you want to put your feet up, you have to have extremely strong and ridiculously well-defined abs to keep them there? You do? Say no more. I have the perfect solution for this. What you will need is somebody in the neighborhood who has cut down a poplar tree and chopped it up in manageable pieces for you to pick up. This is the easy part. Getting the stumps home is a bit more challenging since borrowing parts of someone else's tree without the intention to return it is kind of illegal. To stay under the radar, I kept a low profile while obtaining what was unlawfully mine. Having the tree stump safely at my place, I could start to define the height. So I placed a chair next to it and gave it some thorough thought, because that size matters. Once I was done breaking my head over the height, it was time to level out this crooked stump of wood. I hope my neighbor will do a better job next time, or he will be in a lot of trouble. With a spare leveler and some wedges, I first oriented the stump to my preference. Then I used my patented special tool to mark off the height. Now that I had my cutting line in place, it was time to put in some elbow grease and slice off the top with my bow saw. In case you are thinking, why is this idiot not using a chainsaw? Well, that's because the cut will be less clean, and because me personally, I'm like really fast and stuff. During the second round, I switched angles to surprise the log, and as it was completely flabbergasted by my actions and swift moves, I was able to win the battle. Because of the intensity, my arm was swole AF, and I had to drag it along to give it some rest before going at it for the bottom slice. This was just a matter of repeat process, and since the log was already mentally broken, the second half went a lot faster. Now that the log was straightened out, I could start to sand it down, so I threw away the sand because it has nothing to do with it. Instead, I took my belt grinder and attacked it until the top surface felt like my rear end after a fresh shave. When both ends were done, I removed some dust from my lungs and started to clean up the side with my rotational grinder. Once I removed all the bark and dust, it was time to inspect the wood for any occupants, as the holes indicate this log is no longer vacant. Unfortunately, the woodworm didn't open the door, so I wrote them a polite eviction letter, which I dropped off in style. And sure enough, the very next day he wrote me a little note saying, "Dear a-hole, go F yourself, I hope you get worms, and say hi to your mom for me." Which kinda surprised me because I already have worms. In the wood, I mean. Since this guy wasn't up for a decent conversation, it was time to bring in the big guns. So I bought this can of ex-partner extract, which works based on a proven formula of over 9 to the 16th miserably failed marriages. And it helps you get rid of everything you don't like. The reason why this product works so well is because it induces brokenness. It feels like toxic rain, it will bring you to tears and make you go crazy, create severe heartaches, and it makes you suicidal. So be very careful to use this, as it is extremely annoying. I put on my protective gear and applied this life-altering product in an even manner all over the wood. Who's laughing now, Mr. Woodpecker? Now that this has been resolved, it is time to start with the coating of the sidewalls. So I rolled in my workbench, added a layer of non-stick plastic, placed the log on a piece of wood, and mixed up my polyurethane coating. At this point I still thought I was being quite brilliant for using a PU coating on the sides, as I thought it would make the tape stick much better over the cracks. After the first layer had dried up, I touched the surfaces with some sandpaper to prep them for the second layer. 2 PU coats later, it was time to close off the bottom with a fast setting epoxy. But first, I had to tape the sides to prevent epoxy from running over the edges. And as anticipated, the tape really stuck well on the PU coating. Now I finally understood how it feels to be as smart as Herr Dr. Einstein. The epoxy was still being absorbed strongly by the wood, so after drying I added a second and a third layer to the bottom. Once this was dried up, it was time to move to the basement where flies cannot shit all over my workpiece, as the tiny turds would stay in between the layers of epoxy as small pieces of art. The bottom and sides were now fully treated and ready to be taped off to pour on the top layer of epoxy. All the cracks and openings have to be closed off perfectly or tears will flow. For the top layer, I'm using a pre-mixed UV resistant epoxy so it won't turn yellow in the sun. After mixing and degassing the epoxy, I poured it in the biggest crack of the log until I finally discovered that I'm far less of a genius as I would have liked to be. The epoxy still found its way through the tape, so after crying, I had to think of an A-team solution to resolve the leak. Once more, I thought I had a genius solution, but the sneaky bastard epoxy still found another exit. So I cried a little bit more before burning away any bubbles on the top surface. On the positive side though, I was happy that I had to add another layer on top, because the bubbles just kept coming out of the cracks, which kind of looks familiar to me. As I peeled away the tape, I noticed that luck was on my side today. The epoxy hardened out against the tape, creating a nice barrier to close off the gaps. If you are prone to making a mess like I do, I recommend using a PE type of plastic sheet as it doesn't stick to the epoxy. Once I removed the evidence of my incompetence, I poured in a new layer to fill in the cracks. To ensure good adhesion between 2 layers, I sanded and degreased the epoxy before adding a new layer. Now it was time to add the final layer of UV stabilized epoxy. I poured it in, distributed with a stick and crossed my fingers for the best. Two days later, the epoxy was cured and I started to remove the tape like a professional nurse. The end result was quite shiny, and since shininess doesn't really fit my view on life, I decided to make it matte with my rotational sander. Once I was finished sanding, I could start to work on the wheels. That's where these 2 puppies come in handy. These are homemade inline skates I built for my nephew. He didn't want to use them as he claimed they don't resemble the real deal. After all the time and effort I spent, it's just incomprehensible how unthankful today's youth really is. Before placing the wheels on the fly poo infested bottom, I quickly cleaned up the rough spots with the sander. Then I evenly distributed the wheels, checked it with my calibrated eye and fixed them with some big ass screws. With the wheels properly attached, I could prettify the sides by sanding away any surplus of epoxy and adding a couple of layers of PU coating on top. After all this was done, I placed the log on a flat surface and I noticed there was a slight wobble. To solve this, I shoved a small piece of plastic underneath the wheel, I double checked it for wobbling again, and I installed it underneath the problem wheel. So there you have it, a nice side table or footstool that you can roll around easily. The cool thing is that you can make it with any type of wood, except for the one that you can only harvest early in the morning. If you're planning to use the logs outdoors in the sun, you can expect them to turn yellow over time. Even if you use a UV blocker, this will only slow down the process. These ones have been outside for about 3 years and they're starting to look like cigarette butts. So for this reason, I will only use the new one indoors where the glass protects it from UV damage. Now if you could all keep quiet, I can take a nap and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye!